Welcome to episode 2 of the second season of Starts at the Top, our podcast about leadership, digital culture and change. I'm Paul Thomas.
And I'm Zoe Amma. Our podcast aims to bring you interviews with leaders from the public, private and third sector who are using digital to navigate uncertainty and forge a path to the future. We've got a great episode for you this week with Vicky Charles from Shelter.
We covered a number of subjects with Vicky, including moving to a new job at the height of the pandemic. And I think, isn't it strange how that doesn't sound absolutely mad anymore? And how we can create or embed ourselves in an organisation's culture despite the physical distance between us all. We also covered social media, which has been in the news a lot in the last few weeks and something we wanted to discuss today, Zoe.
Absolutely. So a social media story that really caught my eye this week was about the new BBC social media guidelines, which caused an absolute a bit of a reaction on Twitter when they were published last week. And I then decided, well, I'm going to go away and have a look at these. So we will include a link to those in the show notes. And I have to say that I think the actual guidelines themselves are perhaps a little bit more nuanced. There is some sensible stuff there in places, but there are also some things which, frankly, I find a bit worrying. For example, about encouraging BBC staff not to get involved in campaigns. And there's already been quite a lot of pushback about that on social media, with people saying, well, it's okay for BBC presenters to wear poppies, but yet you're not happy for us to tweet our support of certain particularly important campaigns going on online. There was an interesting point in the guidelines as well about threads and how you shouldn't get involved in rebuttals, but you should start your own thread. And to me, that's missing some of the point about social media, about the fact that it is social. It's about discussion and debate. And absolutely, the debate has become rather febrile over the last year and is not for the faint-hearted. But surely BBC staff, if anyone, should be out there discussing the key issues of the day. Two other points which worried me somewhat were about how the personal brand should absolutely come second to the employer brand. And I think the two things very much need to work in partnership. And what I think is a really interesting situation for the BBC is absolutely the journalists themselves shouldn't become the story, but nevertheless, people do follow certain journalists and they're a reason why people engage with these stories. So I don't think you can completely take personality out of the equation. I don't think that's how news coverage or indeed social media works.
I was going to say that's something in terms of personal brand that I know I've been guilty of using that phrase in the past, and actually it's made me reconsider using that at all. I just don't think it's right to talk about it in terms of personal brand on social media, because what we're talking about there is so all-encompassing. It's not about brand, it's about who you are as a human being. These social channels tend to be made up of almost everything about us. Yes, we might put a front on, we might change the way we speak to suit the channel, but they're reflective of us as individuals. So everything that's encompassed under that idea of personal brand just stretches so far. And you're right, you're absolutely right. The reason I follow Gary Lineker, for example, on social media is, yes, because he's an ex-footballer and hosts Match of the Day. But it's the other stuff that he shares, the stuff about him, his life and his beliefs, that actually make me continue to follow him. And the same with everybody else. So I think there's a really interesting discussion to be had around what personal brand actually means and what we're actually talking about, because I think we're talking about sort of fully rounded human beings playing secondary to the employer that they work for, which I think is the worry for me.
Yes, exactly. And that doesn't feel terribly 2020, doesn't it? Given that we can now all see into other people's homes and their various working lives and pets and partners wandering past in the background. Absolutely. I think there are definitely quite a lot of points in these new social media guidelines that do seem slightly odd in some ways and out of step with how people are using social media now. So there's a point in there about using emojis and to be aware that accidentally or deliberately these can undercut an otherwise impartial post. And I think that goes to one of my other reflections on these new guidelines, was that the whole tone of it is something that does feel a bit like wrists being slapped, being very sort of strict about the way people use social media. And really, social media guidelines like this has got to be about empowering people, absolutely giving them a sense of what they can and also what they can't do online. But absolutely, you need to give people a little bit of leeway and to trust them. I mean, we're talking about the BBC, for goodness sake. They've got some incredible brains working for them, and people who are very adept on social media. And there is something about the tone of these guidelines which I'm slightly uncomfortable with.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. And I think that was one thing that, so I wrote maybe 10 years ago now, wrote the first social media policy and strategy for Grant Thornton. And I think it still remains in place today. There were some sensible decisions we made then about, these platforms are social. They are people led. So we wanted our people to approach it by knowing what they could do rather than what they shouldn't do. There was a point that I made very early on about, you only read policy if you think you might have broken it. Nobody sits down to read a policy, although we've just proven the rule is slightly different because we've sat down and read this policy. But nobody reads it unless they think they might have broken it. And I think putting people on the back foot and making them think about all the things they're not allowed to do just stops them using the channel in the way that it's meant to be used. So my worry is that you'll start to see BBC employees starting to think, well, can I do that? Can I say this? And it will just change the way that they use the channel even more. So I think there is a wider discussion, a bigger societal conversation that needs to be had about the way that we approach these channels as human beings, as employees, as rounded people. And I think it's being brought to life in many, many different ways. I mean, one of the questions I had in the back of my mind, and I don't know, but for example, if Marcus Rashford was a BBC employee, would he be allowed to do what he's doing on social media at the moment, which is life-changing for so many people? Would that be frowned upon? Would that be too critical of politicians, or for example? And I think also we need to recognise that we are seeing this in isolation. The reason why the reason people jump up and down on it is a problem already with social media, that we tend to be quite reactionary to these things. And I think when you actually see this going hand in hand with other things like BBC values, code of conduct and things like that, that I think must play a role. So for me, I think social media guidance, language is critical, tone is critical, but also it does have to be part of a bigger whole. I think in terms of a code of conduct, for example, how you hold yourself as an employee, in all different contexts, not just online, in the office, outside of the office, on public transport, in the pub after work, all of those things are exactly the same, should be treated in exactly the same way. And employees should be given freedom to express themselves without too much prejudice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right, and actually that is one of the things that I think could have some unintended consequences for these new guidelines, given that the BBC is so huge and such a big employer and also a real household name brand. What could potentially happen is that this could start some kind of culture wars amongst their staff. And there was one of their presenters, actually, from one of my kids' favourite TV programmes, this amazing doctor called Dr. Rungs, was tweeting just after the guidelines got released last week, saying that she was deeply concerned by them. And she's someone who would campaign on some of these bigger issues that we talked about. And they go to the very heart of who she is and how she identifies. And you can't ask people to just leave that part of themselves at the door when they come to work in the morning. That just doesn't seem right, not ethically, psychologically. it really seems like so much to ask from someone, and it doesn't seem realistic or fair.
There was an interview that I read yesterday with Gary Lineker where he said that he didn't have any major problems with it, and he'd had discussions with the management of the BBC about his use of social media, and that they felt roughly what he did fell within the guidelines. However, I think you're absolutely right. I think there will be a point in time where somebody falls foul of the guidelines in some way, shape, or form, or employees decide that they're not willing to work for an organisation that is that draconian over what is basically a fundamental human right to be able to use these channels if you want to use them. You also wanted to talk about Chrissy Teigen. Now, this is something that you introduced me to, and then I went back and had a look and just thought was amazing and worthy of a massive comment on our podcast, because this is fundamentally shifting the way that celebrities are using these channels.
Yes, that's right. And that's why I wanted to mention it. And I think we should say it at this point, because it's such a difficult and sensitive issue that she's very bravely started a very important conversation about, and that we're about to discuss. This is something that some people might find distressing, and if it is something that you might find distressing, then please feel free to skip ahead to the interview. But the reason why this was something that very much caught my eye is that this whole issue of late stage baby loss is something which has happened to a couple of friends of mine, and seeing what they've had to go through, and the way in which Chrissy Teigen has very bravely describe what happened to her family and the loss of her baby boy, and how she's used social media to do that. I think there's something incredibly courageous and really interesting here. So for those of you who haven't seen this story, unfortunately there were some really significant problems with the baby and the pregnancy, and she had to give birth early, and very sadly the baby did not survive, which is just heartbreaking. And I think any parent, indeed any human being, will have see that this is just absolutely one of the worst things that could happen. But what she did, which I think is incredibly brave, is that she documented this on social media. So it popped up first on Twitter, where she talked about this is what has happened to me, this is how we feel. And then just last week, I think it was, she posted this incredibly eloquent, incredibly articulate essay on Medium about why she'd chosen to do that, and how she feels now, and what the whole experience of this has been like for her. And as you were saying, one of the reasons why I think it's so fascinating is that firstly, she's created this incredible space for people to talk about an issue which is still seen as a taboo subject, and she's very bravely done that at a time when she's gone through a huge amount of trauma, the worst thing imaginable. But it's also so different from the way that celebrities sometimes do use social media, which is all about validation and promotion, and having something that you want to share with the world and get that support for, that's perhaps a little bit more commercial. But I just wanted to mention a couple of things that she put in the Medium essay specifically about that point. Again, I think this is so incredibly refreshing. She says here, in terms of some of the criticism she's had for sharing the photos: "I cannot express how little I care that you hate the photos, how little I care that it's something you wouldn't have done. I lived it, I chose to do it, and more than anything, those photos aren't for anyone but the people who have lived this, or are curious enough to wonder what something like this is like. These photos are only for the people who need them. The thoughts of others do not matter to me." To use social media, to use your convening power as a celebrity to begin those difficult conversations, and to create this space for others to discuss a very, very challenging topic during this time. Vicky Charles is Assistant Director of Technology and Data at Shelter UK. She is passionate about the value of technology in supporting charities to deliver objectives, improve ways of working, and reach beneficiaries and supporters. She has worked in technology, data and digital for over 20 years, both in public and not-for-profit sectors. And she recently joined Shelter as Assistant Director for Technology and Data and was previously Assistant Director of Technology at Click Sargent. During this time, Vicky has led and delivered large-scale change programs for digital and technology, focusing on strategy, ways of working, and culture change. We began the conversation by talking about Vicky recently joining Shelter and hearing about what it's like to start a new role during the pandemic.
I'm conscious of the fact that I'm having lots of introduction meetings, and I know nobody, but I'm trying very hard to kind of add an element of personality, I suppose, for want of a better word, to it. So sharing something about myself with the people that I'm meeting with and creating the opportunity for them to share back. I'm hoping that's part of their culture. And actually people have been so receptive to it. I think therefore it is. Not only that, but I've received so many welcome emails from people that I've got no idea who they are. Which I think that must say something about their culture too. And it's really positive, actually.
And what is it like starting a new role during lockdown? Because obviously culture is really key, as you say. But tell us what it's like and what else you'd advise other people in that situation, because it's a really unique challenge, isn't it?
It is. I certainly never saw this coming, I'll be honest. For me, I think it's really strange, for want of a better word. I mean, I'm in the same office environment in terms of I'm at home in my office. I'm using virtually the same equipment. I'm accessing the same systems because both charities use Office 365. But I'm really conscious that it's completely different. And I think what's really key for me is that, 2 weeks ago, working at Click Sargent, I had mechanisms in place for that social interaction, for that social contact, whether it was a tea break with people or staff were messaging me, on Teams. I was constantly in contact with people every minute of the day. And suddenly overnight, that's just disappeared. And it's not to kind of sort of do it's not to say, oh gosh, it's terrible, because it's not at all. But I think I'm just really aware of the fact that I have to work harder at building those relationships and building them a lot quicker than maybe you would do usually.
I guess they have all those structures in place. You've just got to find them, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, I think, I'm probably more eager than I usually am, in terms of I'm having those meetings with people, and if somebody says, "Oh, let's have a regular catch up," I'm like, "Yes, absolutely, let's put it in the diary." Whereas before I might have been, "Yeah, we'll get to that in a few weeks' time." But equally, I'm really using technology to help me. So, because it can be hard when you don't know people. So I'm using Teams, the messenger in Teams, to contact people for that, those quick informal conversations. And today I went into the Yammer group and just announced myself to the charity, whereas normally I probably wouldn't do that. But I'm just trying to utilize ways to get to know people. I think my sort of tips would be, don't underestimate the need for that personal connection. Definitely use the technology to help you. Zoe, you sent me a blog to read. So I've stolen a tip from that, actually. There was a tip in that said about identifying someone who can help you with those questions that you would normally just ask in the kitchen or the person next to you. I've done exactly that. I've found someone who have said to her, "Is it okay if I just ask you random questions throughout the day?" And she's like, "Absolutely, yes." And then there's also some of the other ADs in my directorate have just off their own back said to me, "If you've got questions about, is that meant to happen? Is that strange?" Or you kind of have that incredulous moment where you think, was I there? Did that just happen? Then come back to them and ask. And I think that's probably been a real saving grace for me.
That sounds really nice, actually. I suppose that those sorts of interactions do give you a bit of an idea of the culture. It sounds like people are very welcoming and friendly, and there's some self-awareness about where the technology can be a bit of a barrier. Are there any socials or things like that online that they do that you can join?
Well, I'll be honest with you, I don't know. I've heard of a games night in one of the finance teams, which sounds fantastic. when I was at Click Sergeant, we created a lot of different ways to do this. I think because we were really conscious that actually everyone responds to this environment very differently, and there's no one size fits all. So we ended up creating lots of different ways and then tried to work out which ways worked and which ways didn't. So, for example, we had the last Friday of every month, we had drinks via Zoom. And it was very much just a pop in, pop out, as you please. And actually, to be honest, virtually everyone attended, which I think probably shows that they wanted that social connection. We also used to do weekly stand-ups. So just something where the team can come along and talk about what they're up to, what are the barriers they're facing. One of my personal favourites, I know my teams used to put up with, and I haven't yet introduced to my new team, so it's like a nice surprise. At the start of every meeting that I tend to chair, I always ask them to share something that's been a success. So something, it could be in your personal life or professional, and then also share something that's keeping you up at night. Just because I think it's really important for people to be able to share with each other and to get comfortable. And also, actually, I've noticed both charities do those all staff updates, which are always really positive. Everyone joins those, which is really good.
That's a really nice idea. I stole hook, line and sinker. I think it was from Twitter in the end. I was listening to Bruce Daisley. Have you listened to his podcast?
I think so.
And when he was at Twitter, he shared this idea. I think it was his or somebody else that did this thing called tea time, and we implemented it at the place that I used to work, and it was good. It was Thursday night, 4:00, Thursday afternoon, 4:00, and it happened by hook or by crook.
Yeah.
And anyone that could make it made it, and all we would do is ask pretty much those two questions of the room, ask people to feedback on any projects that they needed help on or anything that they wanted to share, and we just gave them tea and coffee and cakes, and that was it. No sort of fixed agenda, no real structure to it, but just an opportunity for people to come together. Zoe, how do you do that in a consultancy business?
Well, what we do actually is not something, it's something very similar. So we do, so we have a very active Slack community, my team. So every Friday we have a weekly stand up, which really helps, and it's a really nice way to bring the team together, because all my team are freelance, so people can also share their successes from their own businesses as well, and that's always really nice to see, because you feel like everyone's rooting for each other. I think it is a challenge when everyone's working remotely, isn't it, about how you bring them together?
You literally do not have the water cooler.
Yeah, definitely. And I think something we used to do at Click Sergeant, especially in finance, they used to do it a lot, would be incentivize bringing staff together through pizza. But of course, you can't do that now either. Not unless I actually looked into how to send takeaways to each of my team's addresses, but was thwarted by, obviously, data protection. I couldn't have access to their home addresses. But also, it was a logistical nightmare trying to work it out with Just Eat.
Yeah. I bet, yeah, that must be that's a real challenge. We're looking at something similar for social CEOs judging panel, because normally I bake a cake and people get excited about it, but if I put that cake in the post, it's going to get very squashed and probably a bit stale by the time it reaches people. But yeah, I think there's a really interesting points, and you've described the challenges, and I guess also the opportunities that come with starting a new job during lockdown really well. Do you think that organisations need to do more on this generally? I mean, do you think that they need to take a very different approach to inductions? I loved your point there about having a really good understanding of whether your new hires are extroverts and introverts, because I think that's so important. And perhaps even more important in this context. So do you think there's more that employers need to do to help give new staff a nice warm welcome?
I love the idea of doing that. I wonder whether, though, organisations are almost waiting to see what the new normal will look like. because I think for charities, for the last few months, we've been very much in crisis mode, and we're now just emerging from that. And I wonder whether I think there are huge amounts of opportunities to do that. So for example, my view is you could have some really great video introductions to the charity, like from the CEO or from the senior leadership teams, from key people. Because at the moment, the inductions tend to include lots of e-learning modules, which you spend hours working your way through. But I do wonder whether, because it takes some investment, I wonder whether charities and other organisations are waiting to see whether or not they'll need to commit that investment.
Yeah,
it's difficult to know, I think, how many people are also joining new I mean, obviously there are people joining during this time. I think for me, I think I've been told that of my tier, I'm the third one to join during this period. They've got some experience of supporting staff at this time, but nothing. I don't think there's been much change to the induction process to accommodate that.
Yeah, you're right. I think a lot of organisations are kind of waiting to see, aren't they, whether this is long-term really entrenched change to the way we all work. Just as you were talking, I was thinking there could be some nice opportunities to do something really creative, couldn't there? I mean, imagine if everyone who joins the organisation, even if you're really junior, you get a personalised welcome message from the CEO. That would be lovely.
Yeah, and absolutely, and also there's the opportunity to really onboard new staff, I think, with the brand and your kind of your key messages and what it actually means for the organisation. I think as we kind of come out of this, that we'll see more and more changes like this. At least I hope that's the case.
I think you're right. I've just taken on a client actually, and part of what they've asked me to do is align social media digital strategy with their brand proposition, which is in progress as well. And actually seeing that laid out in a document really, really helps you get a feel for what the organisation is trying to do, and then enables you to find where they're excelling at that and where the gaps are. So I think that's a really, really helpful place to start.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually, how you align the employee experience with the brand. As you say, I can see there's some really good opportunities to do that if you're working remotely. So let's talk about you a bit more, Vicky. So you've got this fantastic range of experience. So you've held some really interesting senior roles in digital at charities, most recently at ClickSargent, obviously now at Shelter. And you've been working in these two amazing charities, time of massive change. Can you share some examples of how both charities' use of digital changed during COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, just to reiterate that it's only day 5 at Shelter. So, I do think there are examples that I can share that I think are common to both charities. I mean, a key one is obviously the ways of working. I mean, we've gone from being predominantly office based with staff. Obviously both charities would have had staff that were home based, but most staff would have been in the office 4 or 5 days a week. And I think it's been really impressive, actually, the speed at which both charities have been able to enable and support virtual working for their staff. I mean, it's been difficult, without a doubt, and I know that a lot of other charities have struggled, and we were fortunate in that we already had that infrastructure in place to enable it. But I think for both the charities, it's involved mass deployment of laptops. It's been stripping back equipment from the offices to give them to staff to work at home to make sure they've got suitable equipment. I mean, ClickSargent initially went with more of a hybrid approach, so used all the equipment they had, also leased laptops in a very short term, but that's so expensive, so quickly replaced them with purchased devices, and then also supported staff to use their own devices because they just didn't have enough to deploy in the time that we had. But equally, somebody said to me the other day, and I completely agree, that if 6 months ago we had been told that we had to move to a virtual working environment, it would have been chaos. People would have challenged it. They would have said, there would have been a lot of fear. a lot of barriers put up. But actually, in effect, most organisations had 1 to 2 weeks to make it happen. And for the most, and certainly for Shelter and Click Sergeant, they were, as I said, they had the infrastructure in place to support it, but they were up and running very quickly. But I think also, for both charities, I'm sure, but there was a real push to kind of go for a digital first approach. I think prior to that, it was very much blended. So you would have face-to-face services and you would use digital as a tool, I think. Whereas that option just disappeared almost overnight. So certainly for Click Sergeant, they had to digitalize most of their face-to-face services really quickly. And I think, and for both really, it was about providing that support that you would normally have provided, whether it's in the community or through social workers face-to-face, but then doing it over live chat or telephone or using WhatsApp or Facebook groups, and all of the kind of online resources in the websites, and doing it at a time when there was just an unprecedented demand for services. The demand for services just massively increased almost overnight, which was incredibly challenging. And at the same time, having to really push digital for our income generation, because again, face-to-face fundraising, mass events just all stopped. And as I'm sure you guys know in great detail that the impact on income on many charities has been so significant. And so the ability to adapt and use digital for fundraising has been absolutely essential. It's interesting though, I've seen some really fantastic campaigns and some really successful campaigns, but I think also we've learned a lot from it. I think there's probably some campaigns that we've spent too long perfecting and actually probably could have got out earlier, or some campaigns that maybe just didn't quite meet the market that we thought it would meet. As we move forward, digital is going to be at the forefront of all our kind of income generation and service delivery.
I think it mirrors what's been happening with the wider world, doesn't it? Nobody really knew what the general population, like the world population, really felt and could bear. And I think there's been an adjustment period as we've started to try and figure out what people want and what they're able to sort of tune into. So I think sophistication around the message has sort of increased. And we've been talking on this podcast about community and local has really, really been a big challenge. So where the big charities probably see some drop off, the smaller local charities are hopefully seeing a bit more engagement and a bit more local people doing things for local good. You'd hope to think, though, after 6 months that people will start to find their feet, and as you said, it will only start to grow from here as we test the waters and we know what works with any audience.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I was looking on Twitter at the weekend, and I was seeing all the different ways runners were competing in the marathon, although not quite competing in the marathon, and just using social media to increase their potential donor pools and people to support them. And, a year ago, so many of those kind of supporters probably wouldn't have thought to use Twitter or even LinkedIn to try and encourage people to support them. So I think that's really positive. I think interestingly as well, there's obviously there's been like a reduced reliance or reduced usage around cash for obvious reasons. And I think what's been really interesting about that is the kind of the re-emergence of QR codes. Because for years we were being told by so many people, no, don't use QR codes, they're out of date, they're out of fashion, nobody uses them. And suddenly they're being used everywhere. For Click Sergeant moved very quickly at getting contactless in their charity shops. Shelter already had them. It's interesting because I think in the past, pre-COVID, it would have probably have taken us significantly longer to define and implement projects, especially around technology. But considering like contactless, and also for both Click Sergeant and Shelter, they migrated from Skype to Teams, and they did it really quickly. And I think that's definitely linked to kind of the change in working practices because of COVID.
Some of it's contextual, isn't it? So QR codes never really worked for people because they didn't have to use them.
Yeah.
And then suddenly you're being presented with them if you turn up to a pub or a restaurant or something like that where you have to sign in. It's the way I sign into my bank account for example. I have to use a QR code if I want to go from the app to the onto the online site. So they are becoming a bit more widespread. And I think the same with Teams. I worked for a big accountancy firm, and one of the things that we tried to do over the period of time I was there was get people to use the technology, and everyone would always find a reason not to. And then immediately overnight, it's universal adoption. Everyone's had to use it. So it's the strategic use of those platforms. It's changed from, we don't need people to adopt the technology. They've adopted it. That's fine. What we need now is people to leave it alone from time to time. Stop going into meetings. Stop doing all of that stuff. So it's now it's sort of over proliferating a bit.
Yeah, I think definitely interesting. I think there's also been a shift towards using technology for more than just work. When I was at Click Sargent, there was definitely a challenge getting people to use some of the technology and some of the digital technology. But now it's almost like digital has become the link to the outside world. So now, staff are frequently using Messenger in Teams. They're frequently using Yammer. And I've noticed a real change in the use of video, in that pre-COVID, I'd go to so many meetings and people wouldn't turn their video on. And you just get the picture that comes up. Whereas now I go to meetings and the videos are always on. And I like to think that's a sign of people seeking that face-to-face connection.
Yeah, so I think that's a brilliant question, actually, because something that's come up in a lot of the interviews that we've done is about how you deal with that meeting culture that has very much developed during lockdown and just people being on back-to-back calls. Do you have any advice about that Vicky? Because it feels like a very 2020 challenge.
I always thought that I did a lot of video calls when I was in the office, but I realised when I started working from home, the numbers were just astronomical. You spend almost all day on video calls, and it's so much more exhausting because you can't. It's so hard you don't have the same visual cues that you have when you're in the room. So you're spending a lot of time subconsciously trying to read the people that you're speaking to and work out whether or not people are in agreement with you, whether you've said too much, if you said too little, all of those kind of sort of cues that you would get quite naturally. I certainly went through a period where I found that my day would sort of start at 9 o'clock, finish at 6 o'clock, and it would just be meeting after meeting after meeting. And I realised I was exhausted, if I'm honest. I was absolutely exhausted by it. And so the steps that I put in place, I have 1 till 2 now. It clearly says in my diary, it's set from day 1 to forever, is lunch, no meetings. And I'm absolutely adamant that I won't take a meeting over my lunch break now. On the rare occasion that I might shift it, but it shifts back to 12 o'clock. But I'm absolutely adamant that I have to have a lunch break. Because I just found that I was just, when you're that exhausted, your productivity, of course, is affected. But also, some of my colleagues were saying that their tactics were, they would put a slot in their diary in mid-afternoon, it would just say wellbeing time. And they did that deliberately because they knew that nobody would dare book a meeting over that slot, which I thought was a fantastic idea. But also, I think for me, something that I tell my teams now as well is, or was telling my teams, is to try and have a gap between meetings, even if it's just 5 minutes. Because also, bearing in mind, when you start a video call, inevitably, there was always the first 5 minutes of people being on mute, can't get their Wi-Fi to connect properly, something that's not quite right. So I'm very much of the opinion, actually, if you dropped your meeting down to 55 minutes, it probably would be okay. And just take those 5 minutes, just have a break, sort out your Wi-Fi connection, grab a coffee. I just think that it's really important, even more so now, for people to feel that it's okay to actually take those breaks. When lockdown first started, I had that moment of kind of really enjoying the fact that I wasn't commuting an hour and a half each way. It's fantastic. But then I found myself slowly increasing my working day because I was up and therefore I could be working. And I realized that actually that wasn't quite the enjoyment, therefore, of not commuting anymore was starting to get eroded by the fact that I was just working longer hours. So I think for me, it's very much about that it's okay to take the breaks.
I think that's such a good idea to block out an actual lunch break. I've got into a bad habit of having back-to-back Zoom meetings all day. And then my husband was saying to me at lunchtime today, saying, how long long do you normally have lunch? I was going, about 10 minutes. He's going, I always take half an hour and I get away from my screen. And I thought, that's such good advice. I need to start doing that. Because you're right. Otherwise, by the time you get to mid-afternoon, you're tired and your productivity is really affected. It's a real false economy not to take a proper break.
The other thing that I've seen people doing, and I've tried to adopt, is at least one meeting a day do on your phone and go for a walk. A nice set of Bluetooth headphones and just hooking them over your ears, and off you go. You go for a walk and you do that meeting while you're chatting. You can walk while you're chatting. You might be a bit out of breath walking up some of the hills where I live, but you'll be all right, and you're much better off for it. And I also saw somebody in my network who sort of works in the digital workplace space, and he said, be a meeting rebel. Just ignore meetings with no agendas and that give you no time in between meetings. I think is quite a nice thing to do. Not necessarily always the most convenient thing to do, but we used to do it. I used to challenge meetings and say, look, there's no agenda for this, so can you let me have one? Otherwise, I've got other things that I need to prioritize. But I think it's a really good idea.
Yeah, there was certainly a time when I worked at Click Sergeant where there was a move towards what they called walking meetings, where you just go for a walk and have a meeting as you're walking around, and that was lovely. I think there's the disadvantage maybe to virtual working is that there has been a bit of a pressure to almost be online all of the time. And I wonder whether that pressure probably comes from the individuals. It's rarely from the charity sector is what I would say. I have heard seen some disturbing bits on Twitter where there was one organisation where somebody was saying that he encourages his team to regularly check the number of hours that his staff are online. And I thought that was really quite worrying, actually, because I think trust is so important.
Yeah. I think that's right. So a long time ago, before I came over to the charity sector, I used to be a lawyer, and I'm still friends on Facebook with some of my old colleagues there. And one of them was saying, I'm not going to name the firm, but one of them was saying that they've got an online signing in and signing out system, and it's just the kind of thing in a situation like this. You've got to give people, you've got to show that you trust them, because ultimately they will be more productive and they'll feel more motivated. I think checking up on people, you're right, is not a good idea, because otherwise why did you hire them in the first place?
But you're seeing this subculture, I think, coming through of organisations where they are saying that we're monitoring staff, we're monitoring online time, we're using cameras or web cameras to make sure that people are online. And you're right, it just comes back to trust and making it clear that you trust your employees to do the work that they're doing. And if it's an issue of work not getting done, that's very unlikely to be technology driven. It's much more likely to be your people just aren't very good at doing their jobs.
Yeah. And you're right, Vicky. I think there's more we all need to think about as individuals about how we can take a bit more control over our schedules. And I say this as a note to myself, really. I was talking to someone the other day, and I was about, when you just need to get your head down and get some work done, because I feel like people are sending email a lot more now. I've noticed that since we went into lockdown. And this colleague of mine said, well, why don't you put your out of office on? I'm saying, I don't know if that's socially acceptable anymore. No one seems to use their out of office anymore, whereas normally people do. But why shouldn't we all start using it? If you're engaged on some deep work for a project, what's wrong with putting your out of office on for the day and saying, I'm engaged in this and I will come back to you tomorrow? The world's not going to end.
I admit, I would love to be one of those people that could turn off my Outlook. I absolutely can't. I know that is a failing on my part. It's that FOMO. I can't help with the fear of missing out. There's something in me that always needs to see emails as they come in. But I absolutely wish that I could. And sometimes, because I can't do that, sometimes what I would do is I'll take myself off to another room with a pen and paper, and I'll go old school, and I'll do my thinking and my working there. Because if I take my phone or my laptop, I'll be on my email. I know I will be.
It is really addictive, isn't it? On Outlook, can you pause your inbox? Because I know you can do that in Gmail, which I use, but I've never actually done it. I wonder whether that's also a good way to, to stem the tide a bit as all the emails come in.
Pause it for an hour or so. Is that what you do?
Yeah, I should try and do that. I should take my own advice on this.
I think you do need to switch it off, don't you? Otherwise, or turn off the notifications. I think that was the first thing I did when I was working on a Windows computer, was turn off the notifications that appear in the bottom right-hand corner, and that helps. But I think you just have to be ruthless, especially with the deep work. And you do have to go back to the idea. FOMO is funny, because when you're working for an organisation, I used to try and avoid it as much as I possibly could. Now the reverse is true, because I'm working for myself. I'm always looking at email, because you kind of keep thinking the next opportunity or the next thing is going to come in. And it's the same with social media. I really, really try to switch off from social media as much as I can, particularly at the moment. I'm really not enjoying Twitter. And I try to switch off from it. But then I see people, other consultants, other people in my industry sharing really, really helpful and useful stuff. And I just think, oh God, I should be doing that all of the time too. And you get into this vicious circle. That means you just need to turn it off. You just need to walk away. And that pad and paper is exactly what I do. It's a pad and paper, your own thoughts, go for a walk, speak into your phone, use your notes app, whatever it takes, but just try and break that cycle of F5 refresh, F5 refresh.
I am slightly better at Twitter. I know exactly what you mean about that. Our previous CEO, Kate Lee, who's now at Alzheimer's Society, absolutely fantastic. But she really encouraged all of the ADs to get on Twitter. And although, we always say that our views are our own, but we were promoting, obviously, Click Sergeant and sharing our campaigns and sharing kind of best practice and all of those things. And I went through a phase, I think, linked to that, where I was always on Twitter, and I was finding things to post and resharing and commenting. And then I think I had a weekend where I think my phone had broken and I couldn't get on Twitter. And I found actually I felt refreshed because of it. So now I do look more. I do look at Twitter sort of probably. I tend to look at it sort of at the end of the day, between 5 and 6, and that's it for me.
I think that's right. I don't know whether I should say this, but I actually do restrict the time I spend on social media as well now, because otherwise you could literally be on there all day, couldn't you? So you've shared some brilliant tips there, Vicky, as well, earlier in the conversation about how to bring teams together when everyone's working remotely. You and I have had various conversations about inclusivity and how important that is, and how it's a particularly burning issue in the charity sector. Do you have any advice on how to make digital teams more inclusive places to work?
The challenge that has often occurred in charities is that the digital team have been a team somewhere in the organisation who are perceived to be working in a different way and having all the fun projects. And I think that has made it, that's almost perpetuated that silo working culture, and it's made people not want to engage in digital. So, I mean, for me, certainly what I've learned is that it's about being able to be really clear and articulate really well that digital isn't the responsibility of one team, it's the entire organization's responsibility. And I think that your digital team, irrespective of where they sit, whether it's technology or media and comms, need to be a cross-organizational team. They need to work as a cross-organizational team. Because I think that's the only way that they are going to be able to bring the organization with them. I mean, there are lots and lots of ways around making the team inclusive. I've been thinking a lot about sort of different leadership approaches, obviously joining a new organization. And one of the things I think that's been really critical with digital is that, yes, you have to have strong leadership. And Zoe, we've talked about this a lot, like with your executive teams and your board of trustees. But I also think that leaders can emerge at all different levels in an organization. And often when you're trying to break down those culture barriers around digital, it can often be the kind of the more informal leaders that can chip away at it. So I think there's something in identifying different types of leaders right across the organization who will link back and work with that digital team, who will really kind of share that messaging, communicate the vision, chip away, be really persistent to kind of make the change that you want to happen. We talk a lot about always sharing successes, and that's lovely. It is lovely. But I've become much more interested in sharing the failures, if I'm honest, because I think if you think about like gossip in an office, generally people are gossiping about things that went wrong. And that's where people really get on board. If you're someone who's not very good with technology or digital, knowing that not everyone always gets it right, that makes you feel better. It makes you feel that you can kind of engage with digital. So I think something that's really important around those teams is about really being open about what they're doing, how they've done it, sharing what's gone wrong. But I think the next step from that is really showing what they're going to do differently. It's easy to get into a trap of doing lots of reviews and showing this is what went well and this is what went wrong. And then they get filed on SharePoint and no one ever looks at them again. And then you start another project and you hit the same barriers again and same blockers. Making sure that staff feels that digital belongs to them, not just to that team. I think that's really key, because I just don't see how you can make a culture change if you don't bring your staff with you.
How do you best do that? How do you make sure that they see it's for them?
I mean, I think there's lots and lots of ways. I almost think sometimes you almost can't over communicate in this area. I mean, and there's communicating, but there's also engaging as well. But I think it's really listening to your staff, understanding kind of the barriers that they have, but being able to then articulate for them how digital is going to help them solve those problems. Something Click Sargent did for a brief period of time, but they did these confessionals. So I think the first one was the CEO admitting that she had no idea about what SharePoint was. But it's the kind of thing that staff engage with.
I think that's a brilliant idea, because actually yesterday I was talking to someone about how we can use social in particular to destigmatize that fear, because I think we've all in our respective jobs come across stakeholders where you can tell they're really uncomfortable with using a new tool or the level of organizational change. And I think we need to make it okay to be scared and to say, this is really uncomfortable for me and I need some help with this. That's normal, isn't it? We need to make it socially acceptable to admit that we all have reservations and fears about certain aspects of technology.
It's funny because I go to meetings and sometimes something won't work in the room, and someone will say, "Oh, Vicky, could you look at this and resolve this?" And I think to myself, well, no, not really. I've got no idea. I've got absolutely nothing. So I'll say to them, well, I think you might need to contact IT support, actually, because I'm quite open in admitting that I don't know everything about everything. There has to be some limits. But it's interesting. I think people find that really reassuring, especially when you've got someone who, maybe is in a leadership role, but especially a technical leadership role that's quite open to saying, actually, I've got no idea.
I think that's a really good point. And then on that note about what that new / unnerving, hopefully exciting future looks like, what do you think the future holds for civil society post-pandemic? What do you think it could look like?
I don't know that I'm going to give you the kind of the what it will look like, but I do think that there are a lot of opportunities. I know this is a terrible time for kind of everybody, in the external environment for lots of reasons. And of course, the financial climate for charities is exceptionally challenging. So I don't want to kind of underplay any of that. But I do think that the way that we've had to respond and react to this crisis has shown us that there are quite a few opportunities. Charities need to take the time to reflect and really think about what they've learned during this period of time. We've talked a lot about the social kind of connection and how important it is, and I absolutely agree with that. But equally, we have lots of charities with really large London expensive offices, and I think there's an opportunity there for us to consider extending virtual working, downsizing offices, or using our offices in a different way. And that might be partnering with other charities, or it might be making them into much more collaborative kind of working spaces. This period has shown us that we're able to adapt and think quite creatively and innovatively whilst working at pace. I would really like to see charities continuing to push digital as their first means. So maybe being less reliant, for example, on the traditional means of fundraising. because actually digital has shown that it can be used to reach so many more people. And yes, there are challenges with digital, but it can also be an equalizer. And I think that it gives us a lot of opportunities to raise income in a more cost-effective way. It's really hard to make cultural changes in digital. It's making any cultural changes actually is tough because it takes so long to embed. But actually, this environment, for most charities, I would think that they've been able to jump forward quite a few steps forward in kind of that digital mindset of their staff. And I'd love to see, I think, us capitalising on that and really continuing to push it rather than just accepting that it's happened, but maybe going back to the older ways of working.
Brilliant. That was fantastic, Vicky. Thank you so much.
No problem.
Really insightful about the digital challenges facing charities in the current climate, but also that unique situation of starting a new job during lockdown and how you settle in and also how you bring your team together as well. So thank you so much for being such a thought-provoking, fascinating guest.
No problem at all. It's been really interesting for me. Ow, sorry, my cat just clawed my leg. That was probably too much information. I'm so sorry.
No, that's exactly how we're ending the podcast.
So thank you very much for listening through to the end of episode 2, season 2. We'll be back in a week or so.
And our next episode, we'll be talking to Liz Williams, CEO of Future.now. We are also potentially planning a Christmas special looking at leaders' tech predictions for 2021. So do let us know if that's something that you'd like to be involved in. As usual, please do send us your feedback. We'd love to hear about anything that you feel that you'll do differently after hearing from any of our speakers from the series.
You can share your plans, ideas, or questions with us on Twitter. We're at Starts at the Top 1. That's at Starts at the Top 1. And you can email us at startsatthetoppodcast@gmail.com. And please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts if you can. Thank you to all our listeners, and we'll speak to you again very soon.